but yet there is a sense in which every person in Africa ought to have an interest in agriculture, and I do. And only last night, when I was thinking about what to say at this conference, I thought about two things. One, which is a presentation that was made by Kenya's Ali Mazrui several years ago, Africa, the Triple Heritage. And since Ali Mazrui traveled in different parts of Africa, talking about different things, nobody has done a documentary of that nature. And in one of the segments in that presentation, there is one statement that stands out from Ali Mazrui, that Africa produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. The other thing that came to my mind was from some of the writings and conversations that I've had in the recent past about the early years of Africa, particularly the early thoughts of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, as early as the year 1957, stretching way up to 1970, until on his deathbed in Bucharest, Romania in 1972. The clarity with which Kwame Nkrumah articulated issues relating to agriculture is something that I found quite relevant. Indeed, one of the things that stands out, even in those early days, was his belief that apart from attaining political independence, true liberation would only be realized by Africa if Africa could feed herself. And those who write about him recognize that one of his early obsessions was the greening of the Sahara Desert, even in those early days. And if you look at some of the activities that he initiated in those early days, the imagination to create a university that would focus on agriculture and technology, it was in many ways an appreciation of the fact that Africa could only realize her potential if she could feed her people. And after the attainment of political independence by many countries in Africa, the realization that Africa had a single backbone as agriculture is one that was not lost on all the leaders of the day. In fact, if you take time and read some of the thoughts of the early political leaders of the day in Africa, agriculture was always given her pride of place. Which begs the question, why is it that over 50 years after independence, Africa cannot feed herself? And one need not go through all the countries, but one is starkly reminded that even as we speak today, there are muted talks about drought and therefore the inability of the Ethiopians to feed themselves. There is talk about the South Sudanese inability to feed themselves. The Central African Republicans cannot feed themselves. The Nigerians make do without tomatoes, which they love so very much, because they cannot produce enough. We in this country cannot produce enough maize. The Malawians, whom we celebrated several years ago, are now grappling with drought. And the Angolans will have the same story as will the Mozambicans, begging the question, Why is it that we appear to diagnose the disease of Africa, and yet when we apply a new antidote, a new wound appears? These are questions that I believe worry you who are in this field on a daily basis. You who are constantly engaging with new ideas and asking yourself the difficult questions. If you allow me a little room for maneuver, I will remember nostalgically my much younger days in my rural village, when the levels of nutrition, in my view, was a lot better on average than it is today. People could walk to the lake and buy fish, so they took care of their protein in those days. People could till their kitchen gardens, and in many ways they could satisfy their domestic needs. People could till their land without the use of fertilizer, and in many ways they could get yields that would satisfy them and something to take to the market to cater for their other needs. But on average today, if you visit many rural African villages, whether those villages are in Eritrea or in Tanzania or in Kenya or in Chad or the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is a sense in which we have become prisoners of a new way of doing things. Every evening, little children are dispatched to the nearest shopping center to buy highly sifted maize meals. And that is what they make do, making an all-starch meal. Begging the question once again, why is it that so many years after the attainment of political independence, why is it that after so many years with universities that we have created in almost all countries dedicated to agriculture, we have not been able to conquer this problem of greening Africa and making Africa self-sufficient in the area of production of food, and specifically grain? I oftentimes, in my more unguarded and uncharitable moments, indict Africa, that why is it that 50 years after independence on average, without being an opponent of globalization, why is it that it's still Monsanto and Syngenta that must produce maize seed for us? Why is it that over so many years, while being alive to the presence of Kenya Seed and Seedco, why is it that this has not been replicated in different parts of Africa? Why must we still swear by Monsanto and Syngenta as the standard gold in that area? Why is it that those of you who have had the advantage of exposure to innovation in the area of agriculture, why is it that your intervention has not made dramatic changes? And one is not simply saying that nothing has been done. One is asking the uncomfortable question, why Africa continues to punch below her weight in the area of agriculture, if we are to be specific. Why is it, one asks, that Africa does not produce enough wheat to feed her people, while our people love bread? Why is it that Africa does not produce enough sugar cane to satisfy her needs? Why is it that Africa does not produce enough maize, enough sorghum, enough millet, enough barley, enough of everything to be a continent that can sit at the dinner table of human civilization and say unequivocally, we are capable of feeding ourselves? This is the conversation that I believe one must engage in. And we who have the advantage of being present in this assembly must go back and ask ourselves certain very basic questions. I remember in the 1960s, courtesy of history, when many African countries had attained political independence, the leaders of the day were quite clear in their first-year development, 5-year development plans. If you read the development plan of any country, whether it was Tanzania or Uganda or Ghana or Nigeria or Sierra Leone or Senegal, agriculture always had a pride of place jointly with education as the areas that received the lion's share of budgetary allocation. One also saw in those early days that institutions of higher learning, both at the degree level and at the level of certificate and diploma, were given focus because it was realized by the leaders and the bureaucrats of the day that if the continent were to realize the potential, then there was need to give some focus in these areas. Land tenure systems were examined because it was assumed that sometimes the land tenure system that did not allow people to control land militated against the utilization of that land in a manner that would be productive. So that while in many countries there were different land tenure systems, if you went to Uganda, there was a competition between the modern land tenure systems, the freehold, the leasehold, and the traditional ownership. If you went to Zambia, you would find a mix of those tenure systems as you would in Ghana and indeed in Nigeria. But the idea was always, what do we do with our tenure systems to release land for agriculture? And in those early days, in the 1960s, Tanzania stood out in many ways because of the ujamaa. Articulated in a very simple form, Mwalimu Nyerere took the view that one of the ways in which you could productively enhance the utilization of land was to congregate population around areas in the nature of mini urbanized areas so that you could release land for mechanized agriculture. The improvement of seed, these were things that occupied center stage. Of course, many of these initiatives, some of which could be described as experimental, did not realize their full potential and has left this area unfulfilled in many ways. But in many ways, Africa still wanted to rely on you. Africa went into the area of producing young men and women who would be trained appropriately, because one of the things that was assumed that there were not enough men and women who had been trained in a manner that would ensure that they could contribute productively and creatively and innovatively to ensure that agriculture was practiced in a positive manner. The question then that we must ask ourselves, we who are in AGRA, and I'm happy that there is an organization known as NEPAD. There is somebody from NEPAD, and the gentleman from NEPAD will excuse me because I'm going to say something that is not very friendly, but it's not from me. Several years ago, when NEPAD came into being, the president of Gambia, called Yahya Jammeh, with whom I do not agree, said that NEPAD is nothing but NEPADs, that Africans were upon their knees as they kneel and beg before other civilizations. Of course, it was a lack of understanding of what NEPAD was created to do. We know that initiatives such as yours were designed to help in the area of helping Africa in different sectors to ensure that she realizes her potential. Another organization that I'm aware is here are representations of the African Union. The African Union is the premier African organization that ought to be providing leadership in the area of agriculture. And it cannot be denied that that particular organization has tried to use our leverage over the years with a view to ensuring that Africa realizes our potential. But the question that we must ask ourselves is this: is the African man and woman in rural Kenya aware of the African Union? Or the African Union may very well be a jamboree of privileged Africans engaged in activities which leave the soul and heart of Africa untouched and unmoved. And one must now focus on AGRA. AGRA is an organization whose stated agenda is the green revolution of Africa. The question is, after AGRA has tried to intervene and had a presence in over 20 countries in Africa, the question that we must ask is whether your typical average African is aware of AGRA's intervention. Is the farmer in rural Tanzania aware of your presence? Is the farmer in rural Malawi aware of your presence? Is the farmer in southern Sudan aware of your presence? In other words, is your presence being felt? Or you are merely yet another organization in a continent that is littered with organizations which claim to be doing things which leave the continent unmoved and untouched? These are questions that we must ask ourselves, particularly now in the history of Africa. Because sometimes, without being a Jewish prophet, I look to the future and ask myself, what will happen to Africa in 20 years from today? Africa has one of the youngest populations. Land in Africa is reducing by the day. Many African countries are not using their land optimally. If you examine many African countries, and allow me to just examine a few of them and ask ourselves the critical question, what it is that is happening in those countries. Today, Nigeria claims, and I underline the word claims, that is the largest economy in Africa, with a GDP of about 550 billion United States dollars, with possibly a population of about 200 million. They have never had a census in the recent past. If they have had one, nobody believes it. And there is every possibility that the population of Nigeria in 2050 will be about 1 billion of them. Nigeria relies on oil. 80% of its income is from oil production. It suffers from what commentators describe as the Dutch disease. Nigeria is incapable of producing enough rice for her people, but they love jollof rice. They are incapable of producing enough chili, and they love their chili. They are incapable of producing enough tomatoes, and they love their tomatoes. They are incapable of doing things, not because they do not have the ability, but a conscious decision has been made by people at critical positions to concentrate on oil as the milk cow for Nigeria. So going forward, what one must ask, particularly an organization such as AGRA and NEPAD and the African Union, what real interventions must be made in Nigeria, because Nigeria is a true potential giant in that regard. If Nigeria Nigeria were to wake up from her slumber, then the entire West African region would wake up from her slumber. Because one has analyzed Nigeria and the plight of Nigeria and our inability as we speak now to produce enough food for ourselves. One need not analyze Mali. One need not analyze Senegal. One need not analyze the little Benin and the little Togo and the little Gabon and the little Cameroon, because the story is the same in that part of the world. Those of you who have gone to that part of the world, getting milk in the shelves of the stores in those countries is as difficult as getting snow in hell. So there is a sense in which we must ask ourselves the critical question: why is it that those interventions don't make us realize our potential? One sometimes, as one looks to the future and one looks at Congo, a country that is as big as the entire Western Europe, and yet Congo, with a population of no more than 80 million, yet Congo, whose perhaps 90% of our land is arable, one asks the question, if that land were to be utilized productively, that land could feed the entire Africa. In fact, I remember now it being said of Congo that it is capable of doing three things which could liberate Africa. That Congo is capable of generating enough hydroelectric power to cover the entire Africa. That Congo has waters in her rivers that could irrigate the entire Sahara Desert. Of course, some of it is exaggerated, but is exaggerated deliberately to demonstrate to us the levels of underutilization of that potential. That the Congolese soil is capable of producing enough food for the entire Africa. One asks the question, what must one do in order to unlock the potential of the Democratic Republic of Congo? One asks the same question of Angola. If Angola were to use her land effectively and liberate herself from the chains of dependency on oil, what could Angola achieve? You will remember not so long ago, during the first term of President Mbingu wa Mutharika in Malawi, that one of the songs of praises that were composed in his honor was that he found a country called Malawi that could not feed herself, and within 5 years the country was feeding herself and exporting enough grain. We now know that that is not the case as we speak. But the question that one is focusing on is, what is it, therefore, that you who are latter-day missionaries from AGRA, what is it that you must do? What is it? What are the kind of intervention that you must engage in? One can say that countries need to look at their budget reallocations. That is a good point of intervention, so that there is consciousness at the political level that Africa can only realize her potential if she has enough money dedicated to the improvement of agriculture. I do not know whether in your countries in Africa, in certain areas, they still farm in the manner that is so very well described in the Bible, where very late into the period that is set for planting, the farmer discovers that it's too late to till the land, and they take some bullocks and go into some open field. And as the bullocks run through the plow, they spray the seed, forlornly hoping that some will fall in the soil and that ultimately they'll have a bumper harvest. Does that remind you sometimes of your rural village? That still happens in Africa. despite the fact that certain governments have budgetary allocations complete with agricultural extension officers with whom you engage in your daily lives. But these agricultural extension officers are engaged not in agricultural extension, but extensions of their field visits for the sake of extending their per diems. These are issues that we must ask ourselves, so that there is governmental intervention in terms of budgetary allocation. We must also ask ourselves, what about the training that we are offering our students in different parts of the country in universities? I remember in the early days when in this country we had only one university, there was a dedicated institution at Egerton which was dedicated for agriculture. And I remember in those early days, the young men and women who were trained in that institution were exported to different parts of Africa, and they served and served well. But I remember now that those institutions no longer offer agriculture. They offer other courses, including conflict resolution. There is nothing wrong with conflict resolution. But I hold the view that we should be producing more agriculture graduates rather than more conflict resolvers and archaeologists. And there is nothing wrong with archaeology and history. But there is something important about equipping our young men and women with the ability to produce food, because food is at the very heart of human development in terms of the food chain of courses that ought to be offered in different institutions of learning. The other thing that we must ask ourselves is the attitude of the men and women. And once again, this reminds me of a speech that was given in 1966 by Tanzania's president about agriculture. And this is what he said, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, that what amazes him about his own country, Tanzania, is that 99% of Tanzanians claim that they are farmers. But 99% cannot feed more than 50%. But he said that in other parts of the world, and he gave an example of the United States of America, whether the statistics were wrong or right is another debate. He was making this point in order to, giving this example in order to make his point. He said, in the United States of America, perhaps no more than 1% claim that they are farmers, but the 1% is capable of feeding the entire population with enough to export. He said, he then asked the rhetorical question, what is it that we are doing wrong? And that is the question that perhaps I should be posing at this conference, at this assembly. What is it that we do not do right? And this is a very personal question, which each one of us who are in the sector and the area of agriculture must pose to ourselves and answer for ourselves. If indeed, before you were born, Monsanto had been established, and if indeed Monsanto over the years has been trailing the blaze in terms of offering seeds of high quality, if indeed before you went to the university Syngenta was alive and well, and they have been doing this over the years, the question that we must ask ourselves and must be asked of the 20-odd countries in which AGRA is alive and well, why is it that the knowledge that is resident in Monsanto has not been meaningfully transferred in institutions in those countries? Why is it that the umbilical cord remains firm, alive and well and uncut even when the baby is ex utero? Why is it? This is the question that we must pose. Why is it that in the area of husbandry, in terms of fertilizer, Africa still looks for fertilizer from outside of the continent? I was telling my good friend here that there are two things that every civilization should always have control over if it is to be a civilization that will live for a long time: the production of food and the production of medicine. That you cannot leave these to others to do for you, because those are, in a manner of speaking, the building blocks of civilization. If you go to countries in Europe and you remember and remind yourselves of your own history, you'll remember that Europe had to undergo what was described as an agrarian revolution. I'm submitting to you that Africa has never known agrarian revolution. I'm submitting to you that the role of AGRA is to introduce true agrarian revolution in Africa, because it is only when there is a true agrarian revolution in Africa that Africa will be able to realize the potential in the other areas. Some of you who are familiar with agrarian revolution and the indices of agrarian revolution may not agree with me. But I'm submitting that if you only have pockets of change in a sea of a continent that does not change, then that is not change. I remember not so long ago when the millennium came about, a good American professor came to Kenya, amongst other countries, and founded things that were described as millennium villages. It was assumed then that that was the magic bullet, that after the millennium villages had been introduced, Africa would never be the same again. And I remember visiting such a village somewhere in rural Nyanza at a place called Barsauri in Game in Siaya County. And I remember the man taking us around in the Millennium Village. And I remember the man telling us how life would never be the same again. And I remember marveling about the Millennium Village. And I remember saying to myself, lo and behold, a miracle has happened. Last year when I visited the Millennium Village, it was a shell of what it was. The reason why it is a shell is because that intervention did not find residence in the minds and hearts, and therefore did not change the culture of the people. It was a solution that was from outside and was never internalized. I'm submitting to you, therefore, that in trying to green Africa, in trying to create a green revolution, in trying to ensure that Africa changes, we must ask ourselves, what is the kind of change that we introduce? We must ask ourselves whether the culture has changed so that people are wedded to the new way of doing things. Many times, changes do not take place because that intervention is seen as being alien to the environment, as being alien to the people, and therefore when those who have introduced the change, or those who are seen to have introduced the change, have exited the scene, people go back into their default mode and they go back to their old ways. And that is what begs the question, what is the role of AGRA? Not so long ago, I was at a conference where people were talking about population of Africa and birth control. And the story was told of a young girl who had gone to an area in Kitui in Kenya. And this young girl was alone. And she was talking to young brides, on average with 2 children, talking to them about the finer points of family planning. And after she had finished, one of the women asked, "And how many children do you yourself have?" And the young girl said, I have none. One of the women said, you are therefore unqualified to talk about family planning. I do not quite hold that view. I do hold the view that sometimes seeing things from outside gives you certain insights, which those who are inside may never have. But yet I hold yet another view, that there is wisdom in having gone through personal experience, so that the experience, the theoretical experience of the young maiden who has never had a child must be complemented with the experience of those who have had actual experience. And that is why I think that those of you who are in AGRA must ask yourself the fundamental question, why are you at AGRA? Why are you at AGRA? What is it that you want to be remembered for at AGRA? What are the changes that you want to make at AGRA? And these are very basic questions. What is it that motivates you? What is it that you want to do to ensure that AGRA changes the face of Africa? Because Africa is a continent that has now made a declaration that in the year 2063, under Agenda 2063, she is going to be a middle-level economy. Africa has made that declaration. And Africa must therefore ask the fundamental question, what are the building blocks that will ensure that she realizes that agenda? Those of you who are from the African Union, I want to believe that agriculture must be at the very heart of it, because Africa can only realize Agenda 2063 if Africa can feed herself. You who are here, what are you doing to ensure that that dream is realized? In the 1980s, if you heard that somebody was traveling to Harare in Zimbabwe, there are two things that you asked when they came back. One, you asked them to bring back. The two others, you asked them to tell you what was happening about them. The thing that you asked them to bring back was a cotton shirt. They had very good shirts. The other thing that you asked them about was the quality of their farms, tobacco and agriculture. Today, when you come from Zimbabwe, with due respect to the Zimbabweans who are in the room, the only thing you ask, which is the currency that is now alive and well? Is it the rand, the dollar, or the yuan? And I give that example deliberately in order to demonstrate the fact that intervention in areas such as agriculture must also be accompanied by a political system that appreciates people's expertise. It is not the mere possession of the land that is the solver of the equation. The same farmers, some of them who are in Zimbabwe, have now gone to Zambia and to Nigeria, and they are replicating the very same things that they were doing in Zimbabwe. And the land left to the individuals who thought that land was the solver of the problem cannot produce. It is still in Zimbabwe. The land is in situ where it was. So the intervention must also be the kind of intervention that makes people realize that the knowledge must be resident in people's minds and expertise must be locally nurtured so that people are capable of using that expertise for the general good. The other thing that I think is important is to begin to educate the people, because I know you are concerned with smallholders in agriculture, but we must never forget that the game-changing agriculture must also be large-scale farming. We must ask ourselves, what are we doing with the irrigation projects that we find in different parts of Africa, in Kenya, whether it is in Egypt and different parts of the world? One must not lose sight of that. And one must ask, what are the inputs that we are utilizing in order to ensure that Africa actually realizes our potential? In a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, one can go on and on about AGRA. One can go on and on about agriculture, but one must now wind down in order to ask certain fundamental questions. And to me, there are 10 questions that we must put on the table in order to ensure that AGRA realizes her potential. Question number 1, which is the foundational question, is what is the reason why AGRA was created? Why did we create AGRA at all? And my understanding is that this organization exists for, among other things, for the sensitization of populations in a positive manner, that they can use the resource known as land to liberate themselves from the chains of poverty. Question number 2, which is equally foundational. What kind of interventions must AGRA make which are sensitive to the realities of the organization and sensitive to the realities of the people that they intervene with? And my understanding is that AGRA exists for, among other things, intervening in a manner that is sensitive to the cultural realities of the societies in which they intervene, and in a manner that is capable of addressing the economic needs and agenda of the country in which they are intervening. Question number 3 is, how does AGRA intervene? Because the manner in which you intervene is critical to the acceptance of the agenda that you are injecting into the environment. Because there is a sense in which there must be a time when the child which has been adopted must be released so that they are able to go, so that AGRA is capable of saying, behold, we found a child that was incapable of walking, but behold, because of our intervention, it can now walk. Number 5, what are the methods that you are using, and are they sustainable after your departure? In other words, are you entering into the arena with tools of engagement, which tools can be embraced, which tools can be understood, which tools, when deployed, are capable of being utilized in a manner that will be possible even after your departure? Question number 6 that we must have, with what agenda are you leaving? In other words, with what agenda are you entering the process? Are you entering the process with a view to ensuring that the economic health of that particular community is aided? And if you are going to do so, is it visible to that community, and are they capable of appreciating that your entry will make their lives better? And question number 7, once you have entered into the agenda, what engagement do you have with the local expertise that are present on the ground, so that they feel that they are part of the equation, and that once you leave, there are linkages which are there as a point of reference if need arises? And question number 8 that must be asked, what linkages are you creating for the people that you have intervened on their behalf, to ensure that if they produce their markets, because Africa sometimes produces things that it cannot sell? And question number 9, what interventions are you making to ensure that the externalities which may undermine the communities are mitigated, so that these communities are therefore protected from the dangers that may visit them? And lastly, the question that you who are present there are so wedded to the process that the people can see that your zeal and zest and vim and verve at once are transported to them, and that you own the processes as if they were your own. In my view, I believe that if those 10 things occupy the space which informs your engagement, then AGRA will be doing a good job. And very lastly, to NEPAD and to the African Union African Union and NEPAD are useful institutions. What linkages do you have with organizations such as AGRA? What components of your budget find their way to AGRA, so that ultimately AGRA can be an organization that feeds from the breast of Africa? This is the question that African Union must ask. This is the question that NEPAD must ask. And if you ask these questions and answer them boldly, I have no doubt in my mind, African Union, that Africa will realize her Agenda 2063. Permit me to stop there.